Good Monday morning. I need lamps. In last week's video, which we can find there or in the episode description, we looked at iterators. In this video, we're going to look at generators, which is a super weird and foreign and magical concept until you realize that it's just a thin syntactic sugar to easily create iterators. I am your host, MPJ, and you are watching Fun Function.
That's your computer, your friend. It is your friend.
Today's episode is sponsored by Tiptapp, and they are currently hiring. If you know someone who would like to work with React Native and Node.js in the heart of Stockholm, send them to tiptapp.com/fff. That link is also in the episode description. Let's have a look at the custom Dragon Army iterator example from last week's video. If you're thinking about skipping last week's video on iterators and trying to understand generators without understanding iterators, that's not possible. You need to understand iterators in order to understand generators. Watch that video. That said, maybe you did last week, so let me give you a quick recap of how this code works. So we're pulling in makeDragon here, which is a function that makes a random dragon string. So it just produces something like this: medium time dragon, or medium ice dragon, or big time dragon, or medium time dragon, or tiny fire dragon. You get it. Next, we have this dragon army object that we can iterate over with a for of loop, for instance. So we iterate over the dragon army, and it gives us a dragon for each iteration. And you see here that on the first iteration, it's a tiny fire dragon. Whoops. On the first iteration, it's a tiny fire dragon. On the second iteration, a medium fire dragon, medium time dragon, tiny ice dragon. Yeah, you get it. And it gives us a random amount of dragons on each run, as you see here, as I run it multiple times. See here, like, oh my god. It changes every time. The way this works is that Dragon Army has a special property. This is the interface for an iterable object that is set to a factory function, which in turn will return an object with a property called next. That is a function that gives us the next iteration of the thing we iterating of the army. The iteration object is something like this. It's an object that has a value, which is the iterated dragon, and then it returns also a property that says if the iteration is done or not. Are there more things to iterate? Should we end? That's what the done property means. So every time we call next, which is what the for loop does internally, we check if enough dragons have been spawned, which is just a random thing. And if they're not, we return an iteration where we make a dragon and set that to the value. If enough dragons have been spawned, we just return an iteration object which has done set to true, and that tells the for loop here to be like that we're done. By the way, if you think that this inline evaluation thing that I have going here is cool, then the name of that plugin is called Quokka. You can find it at quokka.funfunfunction.com. It's a sponsor of the show. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to replace this iterator factory here, like this, with a generator. It's going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just gonna use the generator to create the iterator factory instead. For comparison, I'm going to just comment this out. Then I'm gonna steal that. I'm going to write function star. Then I'm going to do something that is very typical of generators. I'm going to write while true. Then I'm going to grab this. This is becoming very slow because it gets stuck in an infinite loop. Hang on. I'm gonna comment this out for just a bit. And yeah, enough dragons spawn. If enough dragons spawned, we're going to return because we're done. Right, there are no more dragons. But if we're not done, if enough dragons haven't been spawned, we're going to yield. Oh my god, new keyword. Yield. What does it mean? What is it that we're gonna do with it? We're going to yield a dragon. Make dragon. Bonk. And now we're done. So let me just move here. Boop. So you see, like, wow, now it works. That's the same thing as this. This little thing replaced this. It's a lot shorter. Let me actually close that and just gonna demonstrate to you that this is just the same thing. So if we call dragon army this symbol dot iterator, call that does give us an iterator, just like this thing did. In fact, let me just steal this out and just delete this so that we are not distracted. And I'm gonna just call this thing some dragons. No, sorry, that way. The star kind of throws you off somehow for some reason. So calling some dragons, that gives us an iterator. Okay, fine. Const iterator. Let's assign that to a variable. And remember from the last episode what we do with iterators if we are consuming them. Like for does this internally for us, but if we want to do it like on our own, we can do iterator dot next. And what does that give us? That gives us an iteration object. Which has a value and something that tells us if we're done or not. So let's just call that a couple of times and see what that gives us. Okay, so we see here that we get 3 dragons, a medium lightning dragon, a tiny lightning dragon, a big fire dragon, and we're not done. We're not done here, we're not done here, but then we're done. We're out of dragons. And it doesn't matter how many times we called iterator after that, we're still done. Still, we're not getting more. So with that in mind, let's go back to the generator and look at how it does. So it just keeps looping here. It just keeps looping onto infinity until it terminates here, until it returns. So what happens is that we're looping here, okay, while true is always true, so it just keeps looping. Checks if enough dragons have been spawned. And if enough dragons have been spawned, it returns. So this will just completely terminate the thing, and that is what happens here. But if we haven't enough dragons, we continue, and then we hit the yield keyword, and that will yield a dragon. And that is going to kind of pause the function and just push a dragon up, and then until the outside world calls next on the iterator, it's not gonna do anything. But when it does get the next, it just continues running here and then goes back up to while and just continues and check if enough dragons is born and just does this and until it doesn't do it anymore and return. Screw you, this is actually still very confusing. You've rehearsed this a lot and you're making it feel easy, but it's really not. I'm confused. Let's remove the while thing and just we have a lot of conditionals and weird things and like a loop, and just make this even easier or simpler. Let's just yield the things manually. Yield fluffykinsome dragon. There, and then we yield mark the fine dragon. And you see here, as I yield these values, and as we call next, we're getting them out here as iteration objects. And then we're done. And you can also try to remember in this context that in JavaScript, there's always an implicit return undefined at the end of a function. So if you don't return manually in a JavaScript function, it will return undefined because a function will always return. So we might continue yielding some values here. Oh, we can do anything we want. So what, like Hardy the dog. Ha ha ha, he's not a dragon. We don't mind, everyone's welcome. This is weakly typed language. There are no strong classes here. And if we return, even if we early return, that means that the generator is terminated, and we will never reach any other yield statement. So let's see, like if math.random is above 0.5, then we yield Hardy the dog. No, sorry, then we then we return. So now we sometimes don't get Hardy the dog. And that is because we did this early return here. And notice that even though we have more code here, calling iterator next multiple times, it's not going to give us anything. The generator, the iterator is terminated. It is done. When it's returned, it's done. But before it's done, it's when yielding like this, we kind of, the generator function is kind of paused. And that's something that I find kind of a helpful mental model when it comes to generators. Just think of them as pausable functions. And to illustrate that, I'm gonna remove all the iterator next statements. Now, thanks to Quokka, we actually have these handy code coverage indicators here on the left. So gray means that this code has not been executed, which is pretty interesting, given that we are calling some dragons here. So like you see, like that the fact that we call some dragons doesn't mean that this is executed, and that is because calling a generator function doesn't actually cause it to run yet. It gives us an iterator which allows us to go to the next step in the generator. It's kind of like a remote for a TV. Like the TV, it allows you to turn on the TV and switch the channels. The iterator is your remote control to run the generator, right? So let's call next on the iterator and see what happens. Iterator.next. What does that give us? That gives us an iteration with value flop against the dragons, and we're not done yet. And we see here that this first line is now executed, but not the rest. Not the rest. It has paused here and returned this value flop against the dragon to as a return value to iterator.next, so that we get flop against the dragons. But after that, nothing happens. It stops, or it just doesn't do anything more. The generator is waiting for us to use our remote control, our iterator, to press next. And until then, the generator is not gonna continue. So let's do that actually. Iterator.next and see what that gives us. So that gives us mark the fine dragon, and we're still not done. So you see here that this value here has ended up here as an iteration object. And again, you see here that we never reach these two lines. Let's continue calling and see what happens. Oh, the code coverage is poop brown. That is confusing. It's because we are like, many things are happening on one line. It's a lot easier if we separate it on two lines instead, so that we can properly see the coverage or not. So we see here that on this run, we did not return, and that meant that we continued down here and yielded Hardy the dog, and that gave us an iteration where the value was Hardy the dog. This is interesting though. We're not done, even though we are clearly at the end of the thing. And remember that the yield keyword pauses the function and waits for the next call of the iterator before it continues. So this is actually paused just before this thing happens. The implicit implicit return undefined that happens in a happens in every function in JavaScript. So when we call iterator.next, this is gonna be what happens. Like we're gonna get done true because we use return, and we're going to get a value undefined because that's what we returned. We can actually do this a little bit nicer if we could do this, return Hardy the dog, and that then this thing will never be reached. And you see here like, oh sorry, now the random thing is there. Now here's the case where the where Hardy the dog is generated. You see here that, okay, now we get Hardy the dog and we also get a done true. So this next iteration will never happen. So if you call return with a value, that will end up being the thing that you get out of calling next when calling it from the outside. And notice here that if I just run this a couple of times, you see here that, okay, this time around we didn't get Hardy the dog because this thing here returned false. It's true. I'm sorry, to return true, and that made us return early, as you see here. Like, if we are doing this explicit, like this is actually what happened. When you just type return in JavaScript, this is what the effect is. So that's the gist of how generators work, but I really want to go back to my earlier statements that they are just like a syntax sugar that helps us to easily create iterators. Just to make sure that you trust me on that, I'm going to rewrite some dragons as a normal function. It's going to do exactly the same thing, but we're going to do it with just returning iterators. Let me comment this out. Want to do a function, some dragons. We need a mutable variable called iterations. It's gonna begin at -1. Then we're gonna create the iterator. Iterator. And remember, an iterator, well, you can see here that an iterator is something that we can call next on. And next is supposed to give us the next object in the thingy thing. And the next object is going to be the first object, which is Fluffykins some dragon. But, well, let's actually do that. Return Fluffykins the dragon. But remember that an iterator does not want just the value because it needs to know if we're done or not. The outside world needs to know that. So in addition to the value, it needs to know if we're done. And this for now we're actually done because there's just one dragon so far in our iterator. We're getting there to Mark and Hardy the dog maybe. But okay, this is cannot read property next of undefined. That's because we're not returning our iterator. So this some dragons, so remember it's just returning undefined, so we actually need to return the iterator. Okay, so our iterator kind of sort of works, gives us the value all the time and done true. Let's continue here. We want next to, on the second time it's called, we want it to return Mark the fine dragon. So we need to start incrementing this state here that keeps tab on how many calls we've done to the iterator. Iterations plus. And if we if iterations is 0, then we return Fluffykins. But if the iterations copy paste programming, if that is, then we're going to return Mark the fire dragon. Mark the fine dragon, sorry about that. And like we're not done now. We're continuing our dragon thing here. So okay, fine. This looks good so far. Let us move on to this thing. If we're gonna return early. If iterations equals 2, And also if this thing is stuff, then we're going to return Hardy the dog. Value Hardy the dog. And then we're actually we can actually be done. True. And if otherwise, we actually just return that we're done. There's nothing more to do here. And that's and this is it. Let me reduce the size here because this is quite a bit of code and you need to see it all. Oh, that's tiny. Sorry for you mobile people. You have to squint. But now you see here that iterator next gives us some dragon, and if we run this a couple of times, we sometimes get Hardy the dog. So as you can see here, nothing magical about an iterator. So we can always do what a generator does using a normal function that returns an iterator. But as you see here, generators are still great because like this is very terse and in my opinion very readable. So last week we looked at iterators, today we have looked at generators, but we're still just scratching the surface of all this. For example, iterators can be consumed by other things than the for of loop or manually like we did here. Iterators can be asynchronous and generators can also be asynchronous nowadays. And the for of loop has a for await keyword, so that can be asynchronous as well. There is so much cool stuff that we can learn about this. If you're interested, please post a comment down below on what you would like to hear about. And again, today's episode was sponsored by Tiptapp. If you know someone who would like to work with React Native and Node.js in the heart of Stockholm, send them to tiptapp.com/fff. That link is also in the episode description. And that's it! You have just watched an episode of Fun Function. I release these every Monday morning, 0800 GMT. If you are forgetful, you can subscribe here or watch another episode right now by clicking here. I am MPJ. Until next Monday morning, stay curious.